Hey everybody, and welcome to this video lesson on learner autonomy. I'm teacher Eduardo, and well, we're going to have this presentation in which we're going to explore a little bit of the most important points with regard to learner autonomy in a distance course. Now, this presentation is going to be divided into slides, which will be progressing automatically. And in each of the slides, I'll be touching on the most important points for that given topic, and in doing so, developing the whole of the presentation in the sense of a video class. So just like this opening slide, you'll see the video where I'll be explaining, and on the other side, you'll have the points I will be discussing. So let's get started with this video lesson on learner autonomy geared towards distance learning. Okay, so before we actually get started, it's a good idea to have a sense of an overview of what's coming up. What are the topics that we will be addressing in this video lesson? Well, to start, we're going to have, and hold on here, I'm going to touch a little bit on what distance learning is. So this is just to help us frame what we're going to be talking about, which is a real topic, learner autonomy, but we need to remember what distance learning is, its environment, just kind of brush up on it a little bit. By now we understand that we've talked about it, you know what it is, you have an understanding, so it's just refreshing our memory in that sense. I'll be following up with understanding autonomy, just autonomy by itself, the concept of autonomy in a general sense. So we'll be talking about a few highlight points, developing them a little bit in this video lesson, and that'll help set the stage with these two background concepts of distance learning and understanding autonomy, and as we move forward into the learner, him or herself. So the next section of this video lesson is going to be about identifying who is the autonomous learner. So we want to know who that person is in the sense of the distance learning environment. So using what we've talked about so far, we'll dive into those. And then once again, I'll list a few highlight points and we'll develop them here in this video lesson. After that, we'll get into a graphic, which is what I'm putting here as the autonomy sphere. This is just a graphical representation of who the autonomous learner is and all of the delegations he or she needs to address in order to fulfill that autonomy. Now, obviously, we want to transfer this into the distance environment. The follow-up after that will be some ideas on promoting learner autonomy. So once we understand the distance environment, who the autonomous learner is, well, we need to put that together, and how can we actually promote that as a teacher through materials, and how can we include that so that that concept of autonomy so that we can actually promote it. Right, and the last point we're going to touch on this video lesson is practical examples for promoting autonomy. Okay, so once we've talked about the concepts and the ideas and all that, it's always a good, at a point, we always want to bring it down and, okay, so how can I practically do this? What does this look like in the real world? Or how does this look like in the online world? And that is what we're going to be talking about in the final point of this video lesson. So let's get started. Okay, so let's start with remembering what distance learning is, or well, we sometimes mention distance education, but here in this graphic we have distance learning. So what exactly is it? What does it entail? Who are its elements, or what are its components, and how does it work, more or less? Now, this is in this graphic, well, we have some of the basic ideas. It doesn't actually cover the whole concept per se, but we have some of the important elements, and most importantly, we have the element that we want to focus on in this video lesson. Now, let's quickly go over this, and as we move forward, right, so first off, distance learning. So here we have on the left side, here we have the technological side. Nowadays, it is understood that whenever we talk about distance learning or distance education, it is in fact on the internet, on the online world. So the implication of this is we need to use technology. Now, how does technology involved in distance education? It's not just turning on your computer or going online. Um, that's the basic or the basic premise, if you will. But the way that is used, uh, it actually has other variations. And here we have some of them. For example, to begin with, well, we need to have accessibility. Um, you might think, well, I'm going to put up an online course. It's going to be great. I'm going to use all of these online resources. I'm going to integrate everything. We're going to have forums, chats, video lessons, and whatnot. But if the students don't have accessibility to that, then it's pointless. You have to guarantee that at all times, you as a teacher have to have accessibility. You need to have an internet connection if you're going to use the internet as your classroom. And at the same time, you have to verify that your students equally have access to it. Now, uh, obviously, the internet is highly popular. Everybody's on it nowadays, but we still have problems with connectivity. So you also want to understand what a backup plan might be. In the case that your students, for some reason, lose connectivity and suddenly they're not accessible, or your course is not accessible to them. So what can you do? Um, you might want to anticipate a backup plan as you start the program and tell your students something like, well, this is going to be our platform. This is where we are. Make sure to download everything so that you can work offline. That right there, you're setting up a plan B, if you will. So you want to anticipate to your students um, what what they can do if in case you lose um, access to your platform or even to the internet as a whole. So that is a part on technology. And that's kind of the part that we always understand. But here we have some other points. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a little number there so that we kind of understand the sequence of how we're progressing through this graphic. Um, so in the same relation to accessibility, we're going to move on to high-speed internet access. Now, high-speed internet access is kind of something that's in a sense happening now. Everybody's getting high-speed access. And the importance of this is, well, this same video lesson is an example of the importance of high-speed internet access. If for some reason you had low speed, it would be nearly impossible for you to watch this video lesson. It is vital that our students have the same sort of speed or velocity in access so that they can actually watch videos and use a multimedia to its full extent. Otherwise, well, we would have to revert to just text-based interaction. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it is just limiting in what possibilities we can have with distance learning. For us in our Mexican context, this is necessarily not a big deal, but it's just something to consider. You know, if in case for some in some occasion you end up working in a school that is limited in resources, uh, and then they come and tell you, well, we have internet, but it's very slow. Okay, so what can you do as a teacher if you want to set up an online course in that environment? Well, you have to weigh your options, what you can do versus what you can't do, and then start from there. Okay, we have the interactive telecommunication. I'll just put that there as a 3, but that kind of is understood in the sense of the multimedia. We know that we have the interactivity. Um, Here, actually, in this video lesson, which we're not doing, but I could actually set up an interactive questionnaire where you click and you answer. Um, that's the beauty of the internet because it actually now offers all of this interactivity that we can build into our courses and into our lessons. Whereas in the classroom, well, the interactivity happens between people. engaging and talking face to face and using the worksheets for that, or the course book for that matter. So it's just considering how can I be interactive with my students here. Now, as we're progressing here, I'm going to jump over to this part where we're talking about online classes, wiki blog discussions, and forums. And I'm going to put that in number 4. Now, I'm not following any specific sequence here. It's just more so I'm evolving as we started with connectivity, and then we're evolving into the different stages to build up that online course. So once you have accessibility, once you verify that there's internet access, once you understand that the importance of interactivity, well, where are you going to host this? Where is this going to take place? Generally speaking, it takes place in, like we say here, in wikis, blogs, discussion boards, forums, most importantly, in a learning management system, or as we call it, LMS. So you want to make sure that you make a choice as to where this is going to take place. Where are you going to set up all of the resources? Where are you going to insert, embed, link, and all of that discussion that's going to go on with your course. Okay. Something else that's understood here, and we're just going to drop here a little bit. That'll be number 5 for us on this side, on the technology side. The sharing of the data, or the data, potato, voice and video learning experiences, like this one exactly. So we need to understand that in the internet, just like in the real world, if you think about it, we need to share some kind of information, and in the sense that, like, you have not that you're going to be typing, your personal stuff and all that, but in the sense that you're going to have a profile, a user profile within the system that you're using. That in that profile you might type in some interests, where you are, what institution you go to. So those sort of personal information points, just like you would in a social network where you type in your about, your relationship status, your friends, and all that. You're sharing information in that sense. So we need to understand that also for learning management systems, there is a certain level of sharing of information on that side of the technological side. On the side of the course, there is also obviously the sharing of information, because we're talking about learning English or learning languages. So we have to talk about our interests and our wishes and our projects and our goals and our experiences, because that's how we need to practice with those topics to practice the communication. So we want to understand that and how that can be built into our system so it's engageable and enjoyable for the student. Now, okay, so I'm going to put these two together to go a little faster here. Mobile learning and podcasts. Now this is more of a more current situation. Nowadays with smartphones, we have all of this mobility going on. So you might want to consider that. We probably don't use it because it's not that dominant in our area, but for some reason you might think, well, okay, so I have a web version of my course, but how does it look like in the mobile space? So you might want to adapt certain things, or you might want to have alternate links, or maybe the system gives you alternatives for mobility. So it shows up better in there. Maybe you have a dedicated application. I don't know, so you might want to consider those because mobility is coming in strong. And we already have a lot of applications that are built for the mobile space. So it's something that we might want to look for, not necessarily now, but just to have that option because it is coming, and as we progress through the years, it becomes more important every time. Finally here, and this has to do with communication. So that would be our 7 here. So communication can happen in 2 ways. Synchronous and asynchronous. I always get the stress wrong. Synchronous and asynchronous. this basically means, these are fancy words that basically mean in real time or not in real time. That's it, pretty much. The synchronous means it's live, just like in a chat or a web chat, where you have both parties talking or chatting at the same time. That's really what it means. The asynchronous means it's more like a forum. So where somebody goes, posts something in a forum, and has to wait several hours, perhaps, or a day or two, until somebody replies. It just happens at a different time. We still have the communication, it's just happening over a longer period of time. That's really it. So we just want to have those two concepts clear. That is the sort of communication that we have in the distance environment. Okay, so that's as far as the technological side. Now, let's move on to well, we also have the people side. It's more than obvious. But I just want to highlight that all of this that we're talking about happens in an institution. Or for us in education, it normally happens within the framework of an institution. Um, Now, obviously, if you go independent or if you set up a course on your own, which you can actually do, uh, you're obviously not confined to the policies of an institution. So that kind of doesn't apply there. You, in a sense, become the institution, and you set and you dictate the rules of what goes and what doesn't go. But in normal consideration, thinking that the teacher works for an institution or in an institution um, that's servicing the community in the educational field, then yes, I mean you have to abide by the policies of the institution. How is the maybe they have a specific platform that they are requiring you to use, so you need to use it. Maybe they have certain it could be like stuff like email. They have a certain service that you need to use. Maybe they use certain name nomenclatures for people or names or things, or maybe you need to set up a certain administrative requirements in the sense of documentation. So you need to understand where the institution is in regard to distance learning so that you can play by the rules within that framework. Again, if by any chance you go off to be an entrepreneur and you set up your own course online, well, you become an institution, and all of that the institution was asking of you, now you're asking it of yourself. So I just want to put that there. So as we move forward into what really is important for us in this video lesson. But that was kind of necessary just to help us remember, okay, so this is distance learning. This is where it's happening. These are the general possibilities of distance learning. Okay, so now with that in mind, let's move forward to what's really important, and that is the people. That's really why we're doing all of this, because we are focusing on helping people. That you could say that is in essence the other title, the other job title of the teacher, helper, helper of people, in a sense, because yeah, I mean we say, well, I'm a teacher and I'm helping people develop, but just there, you when you try and refer to or explain what your profession is, at any given point you will have to say, well, I'm helping others, I'm guiding them, I'm tutoring them, I'm showing them the way. So you're going to use those sort of verbs because that's what we do. We help people to do something. That's really it. That's kind of what it breaks down to in a very, very simplistic way. We just build this enormous structure around it, theoretical, methodological, psychological, practical structure, so that we can do our job in an efficient way. But really, it's about people. So once you set up your course, once it's online, generally you do this before the course actually starts. So by the time that the student goes into your course and starts Unit 1, actually the whole entire course is already there available for the student. So that means that you don't have any more material to prepare. Everything, you already did it. So you only have one very specific task, which is engaging with your students. And that's really your job throughout the rest of the course, just to engage and, and, and work with the students in the forums, either synchronously or asynchronously, depending on the sort of communication that you're going to have. And that's really your only job for the whole course, because you already did all the materials and all the lesson planning and all the setting up of resources. Everything's done. Again, your only task is to engage with people. That's it. And to help them through the content. So as we're doing this, as we're helping them through the content, then we start to notice that the distance learning environment poses some benefits, like we have mentioned before, in the technology side, but also some possible threats. And that is where autonomy comes in. That autonomy is what's going to help the learner to sort through all of those things, for the learner to take his or her own choices and actually be successful at this course, no matter what the problems might be. So some things to consider here on this side. Well, here we already understand that distance learning is, well, basically beyond borders, time, and space. Anything that has to do with teaching that's not in the classroom, where the student and the teacher are not in the same space, time, that's distance learning. It's really just that practical sense. Some of the other things that happen is we have expanded connections, in that because it's the online world, well, suddenly it's not just the people in the room, it's the people in the world. So depending on where they're coming from, those are your classmates. So it could be possible that you have students from a wide range of countries, and they're all taking the course with you, or with your students. Your students are, in fact, from all over. So that means that there's that potentiality of connectivity between them in a social aspect. So it's important to understand that, depending who your audience is. Um, Self-directed and collaborative. Okay, and we're going to wrap it up with that one. This one right here. This is the big one. Self-directed, in the sense that, well, yes, I mean, we're talking about distance education in the sense that it is teacher oriented, in the sense that I am the teacher, and I've set up this course and I've given you these dates, and you have so much time to complete the activities, and you have so much time to deliver these other activities, and I will give you feedback on them, and based on that you will get a grade, and you will eventually get a pass or no pass. So that's what I mean by teacher directed. However, within those limits that I'm establishing, the student still has some autonomy, if you will, to make choices. Well, what am I going to do with this content? Is this content really good for me? Or I have here something like Google, where I can search for other content. So the student can take those kind of choices with the content, can expand more on it, can go online, and maybe you have in your learning management system, you have a forum where they can engage with each other, or maybe you have an email. But then the students might say, well, we're going to take this into our Facebook profiles, and we're going to set up a private list, or we're going to set up a private group, and we're going to discuss over there. But you're not included in that. So they have those sort of choices. That's what we might understand by self-directed. They still can choose for themselves and take their own paths within the limit that we establish as a teacher-directed course. And it can be collaborative. The collaboration is kind of understood because it's social in nature, or at least we want to make it social. That's a part of the teacher, where you take this information, you put it out to your students, and you have to promote that sociable, collaborative aspect. If you just put the content there and you don't instruct them, you don't encourage them, well, everybody's going to work individually, perhaps because of the nature of it. We're in the computer, it's just a screen. If you don't tell me otherwise, I think it's individual. So it's the constant work of the teacher, like I was saying before, to engage with the people. That's the only job you have as a teacher in a distance course. Engage with your students and promote that collaborative sense, making it social, helping promote autonomy, and just helping your students not just get the knowledge from your course, but to also elevate their autonomy um, for your course and also for their lives. So it's this grand scheme that suddenly you're taking part in and you're promoting just by putting out a distance course in the online environment. Wow. So that's kind of it. That in essence is distance learning. So I think we're getting a bigger picture now. Whenever we talk about, well, it's a distance course, it's a distance education course, you go, oh, okay, it's online. Well, yeah, but there is so much more that goes into that from the teacher's side, and also from the teacher's side in expectation of what the students are going to do. It's not just, here's the activity completed, oh, you did a great, you got 100, you got 80. It's so much more than that. We're not in the classroom. So all of the rules that we think apply in the classroom do not apply in the online world. We have to anticipate that they're not there because we don't see each other. We don't know who we are in a personal sense. So we don't have the board like we know it. We don't have the desks. We don't have the physical room. We just have this computer in front of us. So as a teacher, you need to simulate and anticipate everything that is not there. And that is distance learning. And we move forward to our next topic. Now that we have a better understanding of what distance learning is, or we've had this crash refresh course of mentioning all of its components, technology, social, people, the institution. So let's focus now on talking about the people because that's really our focus. It's not the content. I can't stress this enough. I constantly go back to this idea. Our purpose is not to promote the content. Our our real purpose, is to work with people in the distance learning environment. So for that matter, we need to address the autonomy issue. Now, before we talk about the people, we need to understand what autonomy is on itself, without necessarily any attachment to people, just the essence of autonomy by its abstract concept. So this entails a series of points. Let's go through those points. Not all of them, but just enough to get a general understanding of what autonomy is, and get a sense of defining it. We will not be defining it here, but just getting to those points to better understand what it is. Now, autonomy implies that learners take charge of their learning. I think this is, for the most part, the most ample explanation we can get for autonomy. Um, just the learner is like it says here, it takes charge. So that in itself entails some implications of what it might mean to take charge. Um, but what we do not want is to delegate the complete responsibility um, and just say like, well, you're autonomous, so I'm done with that. Goodbye. No, it actually means you have to work closely, the teacher with the student, in order for this take charge to happen. But let's get into the subpoints here. We have a few, and see what that exactly means. Now, as a first point here, we have, well, autonomy in its concept is to have and to hold the responsibility for all of the decisions concerning all aspects of learning. So here, this is directly addressing that take charge idea. So responsibility. There has to be responsibility for autonomy to happen. If there is irresponsibility, then the autonomy is absent. It just doesn't work like that. Um, so every time uh, you're promoting or you're trying to promote autonomy, in the same light, you need to promote responsibility of that learning in some sense. Now, this here we might think, well, because we're going to attach all of this to the student, and maybe as I'm talking about this, you're thinking, well, this is what the student has to do, this is what the student has to be. But I present to you this idea. Think of autonomy as a two-way mode of happening. For it to happen in reality or in an online world, it has to, both parties have to work at it. So if we talk about the student and the student being responsible for the decisions, we cannot detach the sense of the teacher as well. The teacher on his or her side also needs to be responsible in helping the student take those choices and take charge. Um, Remember, we always have that dichotomy of teacher learning, or teaching and learning, uh, teaching and education, right? We always put them together because we can't separate them. So why would we dare to separate autonomy from teaching? Just because we're thinking that the student takes charge because the student needs to be responsible. Yes, but that taking charge and that taking responsibility happens because something has sparked it. And the spark was the teacher and the teacher course and the content and the framework that the teacher has set up. So it's also responsibility of the teacher, not just of the student. So there, I said my rant. Let's move forward with this next point. So we're exploring here what autonomy is, um, some of its subpoints, getting a general sense of what autonomy is. Basically, before we said it's about taking charge, and also it's about taking responsibility for your choices. And I'm insisting that yes, it is the student um, that is the person that's, or the person that's developing the autonomy. That is the person, the essence of the person that takes responsibility for those choices. But also, I'm also insisting that it's the teacher as well who is promoting or is putting the student in that position to take those responsibilities and choices. That teacher also shares in that responsibility of choices and charging. The other point of autonomy is determining the objectives. Now, once again, this is a two-party situation. It's not just the student, it's also the teacher. Now, determining the objectives, because we can think, well, uh, the teacher is going to set up the course objectives. Uh, as a whole, you probably already know this, for the course, there is a global goal, an aim or an objective or a competency, whatever you want to call it, depending on what readings you've done for other courses. Um, and then as you break it down, well, there's a competency per unit. And if you break it down even more, there's a competency or an objective per activity or per task. So you have all this world of objectives and competencies. So that's great. But at the same time, the student on his or her side has his or her own objectives. So why am I doing this? Why am I learning this? What is my objective? What is my goal? What do I want to get out of this? So it's autonomy implies that you don't only take charge, but you have a vision of where you're going. So this is important that if students don't have this, or maybe if you ask them, okay, well, what do you want to get out of this course? But that question implies that I need your answer regarding your autonomy, because you're aware. I'm asking of your awareness for your future and what you want to get out of this in the present so that you have a future outcome. If you find your students don't have an answer, then that's the signal for you as a teacher to say, hey, I need to set up some kind of questionnaire or format or something to get them aware, to help them get that autonomy awareness. Um, and kind of getting ahead of myself, you're promoting autonomy right there, just with that little questionnaire. So, hey, you're going to do these sort of activities. What do you think is going to be the result of that? Boom, you're promoting autonomy right there. Let's move forward to the next point. Defining the contents and progressions. Again, on the teacher side, you have the course. And the course is laid out, all the activities, the units, everything is already done. So the teacher sets up the framework of the course. But on the student side, now the student has to understand, well, how am I going to go about this, right? You might have an activity where you have, okay, so do the reading, and then you're going to do a writing, and then you're going to do a forum participation. Okay, that's great. I mean, that's a teacher saying that's what you need to do, and I'm going to check the forum participation and how you develop the discussion. Boom, there you go. But the student has to say, well, okay, that's what you're asking, but at a micro level, because at a day-to-day, because maybe you're setting up a date for the weekend or 2 weeks, but on the day-to-day, on the micro level, how am I going to do this? What are the concepts that I'm going to define, and how am I going to progress through that? Am I going to first do all of the readings? Am I going to do part of the readings? Am I going to break up the readings? What strategies that I'm going to use for the readings? So it's defining. The student also needs to define at a micro level what he or she is going to do and how he or she is going to progress through that. Again, you're going to note that I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit in the next few points because at the same time it's kind of hard to separate all of this because it's all working together. And by this next point, you might understand what I'm talking about. Selecting methods and techniques to be used. So, okay, so you've at a micro level, you've identified, or the autonomous learner has identified what content is exposed for this specific period of time, not the course, but maybe the task for 1 week or 2 weeks at a more close level, and has defined a sequence of how he or she is going to develop through that. Okay, so what's your strategy? Is it readings? Well, okay, so are you going to skim? Are you going to scan? Are you going to predict? What are you going to do previous to the reading? What are you going to do post to the reading? Is it video? Are you going to take notes? Are you going to watch the video several times? Are you going to discuss the video with other people? Right? Are you going to take, and if you take notes, well, how are you going to take those notes? Are you going to check certain verbs? Are you going to check phrases? Are you going to take timestamps of the video where things are happening? There's a world of strategies that anybody could do depending on the form of the media. If it's text, if it's video, if it's audio, if it's text and video, if it's engagement, there's some form of interaction going on. I don't know. It depends on the media again. So in autonomy, in the sense of autonomy, is establishing okay, this is how I'm going to progress, the method, the path that I'm going to take, and this is how I'm going to take that path. These are the steps and the techniques and the strategies that I will be using to better integrate that knowledge into my own knowledge. So let's see here. So we've gone through the first one, which is responsibility, determining the objectives, defining content, techniques, and methods. Right? So those are some of the aspects of learner autonomy, or well, autonomy in essence. The next one here is monitoring the procedure of acquisition properly and speaking. So, and this here, if I may, now all of these are, like I said before, these are integrated, but I think that by this point we start to see that once you establish your responsibility, that's kind of like a big level. You're responsible for the whole package. You determine your objectives again because that's a big picture kind of idea. Your objectives after this course and what you're taking out of this course. But once you start getting into these other ones, this one, for example, defining your content, selecting the material, selecting the methods and the techniques, and now monitoring, I think that we start to see that there is a connection here. Because all of this is happening together. These are the ones that are actually happening at that micro level, at that day-to-day progress. Those are the ones that are really, really important to promote, to have, again, at that day-to-day, at that activity-to-activity step. So now that you have a technique, you're implementing, you're in autonomy, you're applying your strategies, you have a method, you have this progression. But how do you know it's working? You know, uh, not in the big picture sense, but in the step to step. So you take a step, to put it in other terms, you take a step. How do you know you're not going to fall? You know, kind of like that. So, well, you have to check around. Are you stepping on solid ground? Right? Is your foot properly planted on the ground? Or is your leg also holding your weight properly? Is your back leg holding your weight properly? You're kind of taking those measurements as you take one step. And then, okay, once you validate everything, you say, okay, I'm good. I won't fall. Then you take the next step and you validate everything that's going on right there. You know, solid ground, footing, leg, back leg, support. Ready? Next step. So that's kind of what this is talking about. You're monitoring the procedure of acquisition properly. So I made this reading. Did I understand it? I took notes. So I'm going to check my notes. Does that work? Are the notes sufficient? Or are they helping me in the case that I'm going to leave these notes for now, and if I come back 1 month later, am I going to understand those notes? So you have, in autonomy, you're making these questions constantly and trying to validate if what you're doing is actually working. Not just for today, not just for the activity, not just for the discussion in the forum, but for your life. So that's the sort of monitoring that you're doing at a step-by-step level. Now, we have one more point here, and this is evaluating what has been acquired. And now, once you've taken those step-by-steps in the task, and you finish the task, okay, so now you stop and, so what did I learn from this task? That's where we, as teachers, we always ask, well, okay, now write a reflection. When we say write a reflection, what we're doing is we're addressing that, evaluating what has been acquired at a slightly bigger picture, you know, not just a step-by-step, but at a bigger picture, at a task. And once you finish a series of tasks, perhaps you finish the unit. Okay, so now reflect on everything. Again, you're addressing that evaluation part. And maybe after several units, maybe half of the semester, you make half a mid-semester project, okay, which is again addressing that evaluation point. And then at the end of the course, you take another evaluation, that again, or reflection, let's say. Again, you're addressing the evaluation from a bigger picture now. So notice how we have these two sorts of validations going on. On the micro level, the autonomy is checking step by step and checking that every step is actually a fruitful step and not a step taken in vain or wasted. But also we're checking at a bigger picture sort of thing. So notice again how these pictures right here, defining, selecting, and monitoring, specifically those, also evaluation, but evaluation is kind of happening at a bigger picture than monitoring. But pretty much these guys right here, these are the ones that are happening at a micro level, at a day-to-day kind of thing. And here we have, that's autonomy. That's kind of the concept of autonomy, some of the things that go into autonomy for autonomy to happen at a big picture, at a micro level. And so now that we have this concept, so previously we had distance education, now we have autonomy. Let's bring them together. And we will be doing that in the following slides. So now that we have a better understanding of what autonomy is by itself, well, we want to identify now, how does the autonomy fit in the picture of the learner? So now let's bring the learner, the person, and the concept of autonomy, and let's bring those two together, merge them, and what's the result? What should we expect from an autonomous learner to have? And most importantly, from a distance learner to have that autonomy. And if we identify that that distance learner does not have those autonomous traits or characteristics, then we need to make those questions to ourselves as teachers. How can I promote them? How can I make them happen in my distance students? So let's look at some of those traits. Again, this is just a generality kind of thing. There's actually complete courses to autonomous learning. So here we're just addressing some of the most key points that we can actually work with in the online environment. Let's go ahead and identify the first one here. So autonomous learners. So who are they? What are their characteristics? What should we expect from a full autonomous learner? Let's say that we have a learner and he or she is completely an autonomous learner. So these are some of the things that we're going to discover in them. To begin with, that they have developed a desire to learn. And I think this is key. Obviously we all say whenever, like in a classroom scenario, so why are you here? Well, because I like going to school. Well, that's great. That's fine and dandy, but you could like school for many other reasons. For the socialization part, for, getting out of your house. Maybe that's why you like school. So when people say, well, I like school, I like coming to school. Well, that's great. It's good that you're getting out of your house. Good you're exposing yourself to other things. But really, the autonomous learner doesn't just go to school for the socialization part, for getting out of the house, but goes to school for knowledge. Um, we might ask other students, well, what do you want to get out of this course? Well, I want to be the best student. I want to get tens, or I want to get 100 for the course. I'm going to work really hard and gonna get 100. Well, that's great. It looks great on paper. But the autonomous learner understands that there is a huge difference between the number in the paper and what is retained in your memory, in your brain, in your understanding of knowledge of the world for that course. And generally, the autonomous learner focuses on the knowledge. And that implies that sometimes we have to sacrifice the number for the knowledge. Whereas when we get the number, if we focus on the number, we generally sacrifice the knowledge to get the number. In practical terms, I can study for a test and get 100 in the test and then forget about the knowledge. Not important. I got the 100, whatever, I got it on paper. But I studied for that test, and after that test, I forget. Classic high school, secondary scenario. But the autonomous learner will say, well, I want to study for this test. I don't want to just get the memorization going. I want to get a meaningful experience. That takes time. That is actually not going to happen if you binge study over the night, right? That actually takes several days or weeks for a task, for example. So that means that maybe I'm not going to be able to learn everything, but I don't care if I get a 70. I know that's real. I know that's a real thing that I'm getting, and I will sacrifice the 100 for the real knowledge. And that's the autonomous learner. That's where here we say has developed a desire to learn. It's the knowledge, it's the self-development, it's the progression into a higher state of understanding of things. That's the autonomous learner. Now, let's move forward here to the next one and discover the next point. And this, you'll see that it harkens back to what we were talking about previously about taking charge, about responsibility. And here we have it now addressed or attached to the person. Have accepted learning responsibility. And once again, like I was saying in my example here, I will be responsible for my learning. So that means that I will take the time to program, to study, to schedule my learning sessions, and also to be responsible for the number that the teacher puts. If I get 100, it's because I also feel like I deserve, because I have a meaningful experience. I have a meaningful understanding of the content. I will not give you, if you ask me something about the course, I will not give you the textbook definition of the course. I will give you a meaningful, in-depth, filled with emotion and understanding, with personal reflection and content knowledge, and it will merge it all together and give you the answer. When somebody does that, you know that, wow, you're an autonomous learner because you were able to do that. when learners have not accepted that sort of responsibility of that, uh, how profound that can be, they generally give you a textbook definition. They probably memorize the competency of the course and they give you that as a response. Well, what'd you get out of it? Well, I got this and this and that. Oh, and then you read the competency of the course and oh, that's exactly what you answered. Hey, you memorized that. So, um, so it's taking that responsibility. Next point here is have developed a metacognitive awareness. Yes. So, when we're talking about learner autonomy or autonomous learner, however you want to place it, we always come up with this word. This word always comes up, metacognitive. What the heck is a metacognitive awareness thing going on here? You probably are familiar with this, probably not. But metacognitive, well, we can break it up into two parts. Let me just go here, change colors. So let's go for the obvious, cognitive. And I think cognitive is a little more reachable in that it means cognition, the brain processes, how you're thinking, right? And let's break this up into orange. We'll take orange and we have the meta. Not the meta as in like in Spanish, as in meta, as in finish, but here what we're addressing is in meta as onto itself. You know, like that movie Inception, like the dream and the dream and the dream. That's what we're talking about here. When we say metacognitive is thinking about thinking. In layman's term, that's what we're saying. It's thinking about thinking. It's also that expression we have at a university level. It's learning to learn, right? Aprender, aprender. So when a concept falls onto itself, that's meta. So the autonomous learner is aware of how he thinks, of how he or she thinks, of how he or she processes information. It's like, this is who I am. It has a sense of identity at a deep level. And this is how I process information. This is what I need. And these are the mental structures that happen when I learn something. If they don't exist, if they don't happen, then I don't learn. It's really just that. So the autonomous learner is aware of what he or she needs at a cognitive level for learning to happen. A cognitive level, and we can also add their emotional level. I need to be in a certain state of motivation for me to have a meaningful experience in learning. If I don't have that sentiment, then learning is not really going to happen for me. So I need to, and if I don't have it, what can I do to get it? Maybe listen to some music, maybe go out, take a walk for 5 minutes and then come back. And now I'm ready, That's the autonomous learner is responsible. So maybe he or she sets, so I'm going to study from, I don't know, let's say from 5 to 7 p.m. So 5 p.m. comes up and the autonomous learner says, I'm not feeling it. I know I have my time right now for studying this, but I'm not in the right mood. I had some problems before earlier today, and now it's like, I'm having a hard time. So instead of saying, I'm going to drop in, I'll study another day, the autonomous learner will take the responsibility, will kick in and say, well, what can I do to get in the mood, to get in that motion of studying? Could be, like I said, I'll go take a walk for 5 minutes, kind of get some fresh air. I need to clear my head, get my emotions straight, and then comes back after 5-10 minutes. Okay, I'm ready to go and start studying. So a lot of things happen in that. Instead of just saying, I'm not in the mood, I'll do it some other day. I'll cram for the test. That is not the autonomous learner. The autonomous learner is aware of what he or she needs and gets the job done when he or she said the job would be done for studying in that sense. Moving forward here, the autonomous learner has developed, or the autonomous learners have developed, learning strategies. Again, this also was mentioned in the autonomy as a concept, but now again we're applying it and attaching it to people. So, like I mentioned before, you have strategies. So you identify, but the strategy is dependent on the content and the form of the content. So as an autonomous learner, you the teacher the teacher gives you content in some form. Let's say reading. So you're the autonomous learner, and you say, well, okay, so here I have a content. It's in reading. Immediately, boom. What are my strategies? How can I get to this content so it's meaningful for me? Because maybe you're more of a visual person like me. So you go, well, I like reading. That's great, but for me to actually get this, I need to put it in a visual form. How are you going to do that? That's your strategy. Or maybe you have a podcast for the lesson. So great, but I'm not auditive. I'm kinesthetic. I like movement. So, man, listening to this podcast, man, that's boring. But because you're autonomous, your responsibility kicks in, and you say, well, man, how can I do this? Okay, so I need to transfer that audio into movement because I know I'm movement. I'm metacognitive. I know what I need here, and I know what I need in my emotions. So how can I transfer that? So maybe, I don't know, you set up a strategy where you're moving and you're listening. You have maybe your earphones and you're kind of imitating. Whenever you hear verbs, you put them out into your hands. That kind of gets motion in there, and suddenly it's meaningful now for you. Right? So to have these strategies, what I'm saying is it depends. It depends on the content, the form of the content, and it depends on the person. So when you put those two combinations together, a certain strategy is going to come out. The way of how you're going to get to this content so it's meaningful. The next one here is adapt their learning strategies to the requirement of the task. And again, this is very much like the one I just said. Depending on the content and depending on the person, you will match the two and to get a strategy so that the content is meaningful. So we can move on to the next one here. Actively seek practice opportunities. This is where another one, just like that responsibility coming in. It's not just about, well, here's the content. I did a few strategies. I got it. That's it. End of story. Not really. Not for the autonomous learner, because the autonomous learner is going to take that information outside of the form, the print of the PDF file, of the video, of the podcast, of whatever, and is going to start identifying it in the real world, in the immediate real world. So it's going to start, so how does this apply to my family environment? How does this apply to my friend environment? How does this apply to my work environment? How does this apply to my house, to my neighborhood, to the world? So it starts thinking outside of the frame of the content presentation. And when you start engaging with people, you start remembering that information, and you start, hey, there it is. Oh, there it is. There it is. And you start becoming aware of it, of how it is working in reality in society. And that is you start looking for it after a little bit. And that's what this means. So notice how I think we have one more. Yes, have developed criteria for self-assessment. And again, we had these two before at the last point, autonomy itself. And I was mentioning how it is at a micro level and is at a big picture kind of level. And again, the person will have developed some form of method or strategy to test him or herself. It could be something as simple as, okay, I remember I read something 2 days ago. Okay, so if I can remember 5 points, got it. So, and you start going through it. Boom, 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 boom. Oh, I just remembered 4. So I need to go back and check. But you're being autonomous in the sense that you're self-assessing yourself of what you know. Or I remember I read, or I was exposed to content which talked about certain things in society. So you go out, I'm going to go out in society in a few minutes, and I'm going to check if I find it. If you don't find it, why didn't I find it? So you have to go back to the content and check it. Oh, there it is. I was skipping this part. So that self-assessment implies that you're recycling the content over and over again. And that recycling is what's really getting for you to be meaningful knowledge. We're missing one point here. Now, this is going to look terrible. I'm sorry. But I'll put it in green. And I think I'll thicken the pen. I'll try and do this to the best of my writing abilities, but I want to tell you in advance they're not very good. Okay, and I think by now you probably know where I'm going with this. Almost. Okay, 2 more letters. Intrinsic. What we're seeing out of all of this is that there is some sort of intrinsic motivation going on here. It's not just, yes, there is the extrinsic motivator where the teacher is promoting, the teacher is telling, hey, if you want to get a 10, you're doing really well. As a teacher, you start feeding positive things to the learner, right? And that's the extrinsic motivation. And you also tell the student, well, what do you want to get out of this? So the student sets a goal. And that's also an extrinsic motivator. But the autonomous learner has intrinsic motivation. Looks to find the content in the real world, looks to the value in the knowledge, not the number. So it has those intrinsic markers or flags to get something meaningful out of this. And in essence, that is what an autonomous learner is. Very interesting. It's a little more than just a, hey, I know what to do. It goes far more than that. I think as many concepts that we're touching on in this video presentation. So in this slide, we have here a more graphical representation of what the autonomous learner is and what is involved in the learner autonomy. Before, in the previous one, we had the list. So here again, it's more of a visual representation. We could pretty much see the same ideas, maybe with a few other ones that were not mentioned before. So I'll just go really, really quick through this one. I think with the previous content that we've discussed or that I've presented to you here, I think you're getting a much better understanding of what this is. But again, let's just go super quick here. Now, I'll use orange for this one. So the objective here is at the top, managing my own learning. That is another way of saying autonomy. I am autonomous. I manage, I administer, I am responsible for my learning. Okay, so that's great. But what does that imply? And I think you already know what that means. But again, here is at a three-dimensional sphere, so to speak. So you'll notice that all of these go off into different subspheres. We have this cooperating here in the middle. Cooperation is super important in autonomy. Most importantly, if you're interpersonal, no, not so much because you can study by yourself. But if you're interpersonal, sorry, then that collaboration will become super important, right? You will look to collaborate with other people, to work in teams, pairs, so on. There is evaluation going on. We were talking before about how you evaluate and you monitor on a micro level and at a big picture kind of thing. You're planning. And planning happens at the beginning, generally speaking. Evaluation happens towards the end. Well, we were mentioning, here's monitoring, by the way. So this happens on a day-to-day level. This happens at a bigger picture kind of thing. Planning happens at the beginning of something. And also you're constantly monitoring that plan and see if you need to adjust it. Choosing materials and methods. Okay, so as you're being exposed to content, the teacher is giving you the material, but as an autonomous learner, you're also saying to yourself, well, is this really what I need? Or is this the presentation that I needed in? And if it is, great. If it's not, well, how can I adapt it? And you're constantly checking. So you'll notice that I mentioned before that the intrinsic motivator was a key here, was the implication. You'll notice that also the other implication is you're constantly evaluating and validating something, either if it's content, if it's the way something is presented, if it's the outcome, if it's if it's your self-learning, if it's your thinking, you're constantly evaluating and checking that everything is working. And if it is, then you move forward with it. If it's not, then you adapt it and then you move forward. Um, okay, and then completing the tasks, which is really the objective of everything. It's just to complete the task, get meaningful experience out of it, and move forward. And you'll notice how all of the arrows here, they imply that everything is happening together at the same time. So when you're planning, it's not just the planning, but you're monitoring and you're evaluating. Notice how the arrows go back and forth. When you're choosing materials, also you're evaluating and you're monitoring and you're completing a task, because this in itself is a task, and you're also planning. So notice how all of these work together in synergy. There's a synergy going on, boom, back and forth, back and forth. And so we might present it as a list, and as a bullet point and whatnot, but really it's all part of an integral system that conforms what the autonomous learner is, what autonomy is, and what the autonomous learner ends up being. Okay, and below here we have what I was mentioning before, the intrinsic level. So I'm motivating myself with no regard if I am intrapersonal or interpersonal, whatever. But by being autonomous, I have the capabilities of keeping myself motivated in some way. I have my strategies for motivating myself. That's kind of what you're saying here. Dealing with my feelings. This is so important. We generally, when we talk about academics, content, we always think about the brain, the processes, the abilities, the sub-abilities, and so on. And we always forget to talk about emotions. And emotions are so important. Because in my previous example, I was saying, if maybe you, as an autonomous learner, you set a schedule from 5 to 7, but then comes the time for studying, and you're like, I'm not feeling it, I had a discussion before, and I'm angry now. Oh, are you going to study when you're angry? Probably not. You understand as an autonomous learner that you need to be calm, you need to be in a positive frame of mind, you need to be in a positive frame of emotions as well. So you need to do something about it, get yourself to that place, and then you study. Maybe it's going to take up 20 minutes of your study time. Maybe you set 2 hours, and at the beginning of that, you were not in that place. So you need to do something about it, and maybe that's going to take 20 minutes. So now you have 1 hour and 40 minutes. It's better. That's, as an autonomous, you take that responsibility and you weigh the benefits and the cons and the pros. And you might say something like, well, I needed to take 20 minutes out of my study time to get myself in that place. But that's okay because I still have 1 hour and 40 minutes to do that, to study. So you go, yeah, it's worth it. Those 20 minutes are worth it because I'm going to get a lot more than to just say, forget it. I'll do it some other time. Then you lost it. You're not respecting your schedule. You're not being responsible. And, you're not being autonomous in the big picture. So emotions are important. So that's also where that factor of, hey, you did a great job. That's excellent. As a teacher, you're promoting that dealing with emotions and feelings by giving that positive feedback and structuring knowledge. There it is. The autonomous learner understands how to structure knowledge for him or her benefit. Again, as a teacher, we present knowledge in general. We kind of take the broad strokes approach because sometimes we have so many students, we're limited in time and resources. So we're kind of forced to kind of get to those broad strokes. So as a student, as an autonomous learner, I get those broad strokes and I fracture them down into what I need because this is how my brain works. I know how it works. I'm metacognitive in that way. Remember what metacognitive is? I know that. I am aware of those structures, those mental structures. So I'm going to adapt the way the teacher is giving content to me, and I'm going to adapt it to how I work. And that way you're structuring knowledge. not just for the test, not just for that week, not just for that unit, not just for that course, but for your life. Suddenly, you become knowledgeable in your life, and that course becomes a puzzle of your life, and not just, I took this other course. I don't know what it was, but I took it and I got a paper out of it, which is great. We live in a society where they demand papers from us. You need your certificate of this, you need your validation of this other thing. So we need all these papers, and that's great. But you have to be honest with yourself as an autonomous learner and say, well, I'm going to get this knowledge, and maybe from this 100%, I'm just interested in this 30%. That's really what's super meaningful to me. And I'm going to do everything I can in my power to get that 30% of the 100 from that course and take it with me for the rest of my life. That's, you're being incredibly autonomous in that way. And you might think, well, I'll try and get the 100, but because knowledge is more important for me as an autonomous learner, I am willing to sacrifice that 100%. I still want to pass. I have to pass because if not, I can't progress. So I need to pass. But I am aware that the 100% is not an option for me. I can live with an 80. I can live with a 90. I can live with a 70 perhaps. You have to, as an autonomous learner, you also have to weigh yourself. Like, how far low am I willing to go for knowledge? Sometimes it might be the case where you go, well, I really want the knowledge, but oh my God, if I get a 70, I'm not going to pass the course. So, you have to kind of put the knowledge aside and focus on the number for that case. But again, these are the kind of choices that as an autonomous learner, you're constantly making because you're aware, because you're conscious, because you know what you want to get out of something. And that is, in essence, just to kind of summarize everything we've been talking about here, what the autonomous learner is. So in the same way that we generally do not separate learning from teaching, in the same light, we can't separate the student from the teacher. We can't separate the teacher's activities from the student's activities because they're closely intertwined. What one does is reflected upon the other, and what the other does is reflected upon the one. So this happens on a class-to-class level, and in a distance course happens pretty much all the time. So yes, it is important as a teacher to understand what autonomy is, what the structure of the distance course is, what autonomy is, who my autonomous learners are, and what I should expect from them. And if they don't have that, how can I promote it? But I also need to point the finger at myself and say, again, well, I kind of answered it right now. What can I do? What does the autonomous learner expect from me? How can I promote autonomy as a teacher in this course? So we can't talk about one without talking about the other. So here we have a few other points. Now from the teacher side, and I'll go fairly quick through these. So what are some of the things that the teacher should do when trying to promote autonomy? So encourage. It's not so much about, that's a little too thick. It's not so much now about, teaching and telling and doing that kind of thing. That's, if you're in 1970, maybe that was the way we taught, 1920. But now in the new millennia, it's more about the person and what the person needs and motivate, and those sort of things. So we encourage. Now, the thing about that happens here is I kind of dig into the concepts by themselves that I rarely mention what this is applying to in a practical sense. And we should remember that we are studying, we're educating, we're developing our teachers as language teachers. So this is for language. So you're looking at autonomous learners in teaching them English or whatever language you want to focus on. So you encourage in the target language. Now, obviously, again, as a teacher, you need to make choices. Everybody needs to make choices. Um, it would be very different if you're teaching somebody online who is at a level 1, English 1, versus somebody that's at an English 5 or an English 6. Obviously, the way you're going to use the target language and how much of the native language, in our case Spanish, are you going to use? Uh, Obviously, the degrees of usage are going to vary greatly. Um, but again, as a teacher, you take those choices. Okay, so here, because you're level 1, I'm going to use your native language. Um, but for these other activities, we're going to use a target language because I know that you've worked with this language so far, and I know you can communicate in this way. So you take those choices as a teacher. Something else you do as a teacher is involve the learners in a nonstop quest for good learning activities. So the students will come to you and think of you as the expert. You not only encourage them to use a language, but they see you as, well, you're the physical, in a way. If you use video presentations like this, or you post up pictures of yourself, like, hey, I'm your teacher, and here's a picture of me, like that kind of thing. Or if there's a picture in your teacher profile that the students can see that you're a real person, um, so they come to you, they get that image of you, and they address it as, you're the expert. You're the person that's going to tell me what's right and wrong. They're not directly telling you, but it's implied in what they do. It's implied in the reason that they are there with you. So in that sense, you need to involve them. That means that they don't know, or you should probably think of this as a premise, that they don't know what's good and what's bad as far as learning activity goes. So it is your job to tell them, hey, I have this awesome learning activity for you. Oh, the teacher said awesome. So, and then they see it and then, oh, you were right when they do it. And they go, yeah, it was awesome. So right there, you're telling them what's good and what's not. You might tell them, so here's another activity. It's kind of easy. It's kind of simplistic. Not awesome. It's okay. And then they go, oh, okay. Yeah, you were right, teacher. It was okay. So you're telling them indirectly what's good and what's bad. And then when you, at some point, you tell them, okay, so I want you to go to Google and search for some activities. I want you to search for awesome activities. And now, because you have previously told them what's good and bad, they have a better understanding of what to look for, even if you kind of leave it like broad like that. So you want to involve them, and you tell them what's good and what's bad, and also using their comments and feedback. You kind of help them in that sense, like, oh, this is good, this is bad. So it's not just about the content, like I said at the beginning of this video lesson. The teacher really sets up the course for the one purpose of engaging with people, and that engagement, you tell them what's good and what's bad. You help learners, again, super important to what we really do. We are helpers, we are assistant people. Help learners set their own learning targets and choose their own learning activities. Again, this is harkening back to, and we'll put it over here, to AL, autonomous learning. Super important. This is directly addressing that, because you know that the autonomous learner will set his or her own goals. You might have your own course competencies and objectives, but as an individual, as a student, autonomous learner, I have my own purposes that I want to get out of this course. So you help your students do that, if in case they don't know what they are. Require learners to identify individual goals, but pursue them through collaborative work in small groups. So yes, this is kind of, these two are fairly similar, but you will notice that the first one here, where you're helping them, it's more of an individual level, and over here is more, okay, so how am I gonna work and collaborate with groups of people? Because at the end of the day, we live in a society and we need to engage with other people. So your language class should also lead to that in some way at some point. actually at several points. Um, it's not just study the grammar, check the vocabulary, and do all these things, but okay, now work with other people, engage, communicate, discuss. So you need to get all these other activities going at some point, and again, at many points, to engage and collaborate with other people, because that's really what we learn languages for, to collaborate in groups. Require learners to keep a written record of their journals. This is an autonomous learner strategy that we use a lot. It's fairly popular nowadays, and I think you probably, as students, as a university students, you have had some teachers ask of you, well, keep a record, and you're gonna and your journal or your diary is going to be evaluated at the end of this course. Um, so this is really important also. Now, what to include in these sort of journals? We might think, well, there's sorry, got my brain just went blank for a minute there. What to include in these journals? Normally, we focus on the content. So you ask your students, collect all of the content that's meaningful for you from this course and put it into a journal. And that's what you're going to deliver to me at the end. And that's great, because it helps them to consolidate and helps them to create links between the content in a more personal way. So that's awesome. But you also want to include some kind of diary where they're writing their experience from an individual standpoint. Something like, so it could be like a weekly thing, or when I've done this with my English classes, I generally set a weekly deadline, not a daily one, because a daily could be very, very crazy, especially for people that are working. And so if they're taking your course online, you should understand that they're doing that because they can't go to school and stick to a school schedule. So maybe a weekly or a bi-weekly would be more or less appropriate. You should understand and engage your students as you're going into the course, but let's say weekly for this time. So on a weekly, you might tell them, okay, so I want you to write in a journal diary section your experience for that week. Did you like it? You didn't like it? What was difficult? What was easy? Uh, how is that going to help you? So you might set up some guide questions that could be general for all weeks, and that gives the student some focus as to, okay, so what am I going to write? So you maybe set up some guide questions that can work for all of the weeks. Like, for example, so be sure to answer these questions in your weekly diary. So what did I learn this week? What was difficult? What was easy? How is this? How was this week going to help me in my language learning for the future? Boom, that's it. Just like 4 questions. You don't want to get it complicated. It's always easy, simple, to the point. And the student can just answer those questions every week and suddenly has a meaningful journal diary experience that's keeping a record of it week after week. And that, in combination with the summaries he or she is making of your content, then suddenly has the most valuable resource he or she could ever have, because it's what's important to that specific student. Right? So learning journals are awesome if they're done right. Um, I actually have a video that I recorded a few years ago. I will be sure to link to it in the note that's accompanying this video lesson, if in case you want to check it out. In that video, I mentioned some of this, how you can section out a learning journal, what you can put in it, how you can connect it. So look for that link in the note that's attached with this video lesson. Okay, and we have one more point here. Engaging learners in regular evaluation of their progress. There's evaluation again. Evaluation has come up so many times. And because evaluation is so important, because that's the way you're monitoring yourself. And as a teacher, you need to, yes, if we think from the institutional standpoint, then yes, I need to put a test. I need to see that you're learning, and because I need to report a number back to my institution. Yeah, but let's take that equation. Let's take that out of the equation for this, and let's just focus on the people. So the autonomous learner is going to want to self-monitor and self-evaluate. But as a teacher, you also want to promote that, and you want to help the student self-monitor and evaluate. So to make sure that he or she is actually learning in a cumulative, what's the word, that is accumulating, that's better, that so that he or she can verify that he or she is accumulating all of this knowledge for the linguistic purpose of communicating in a meaningful way. So you promote that. So how can you validate? How can you check? You might give tips like if, for example, you're looking at the simple present, you're looking at routines and as a topic, right? And embedded into that topic is the simple present. So you might want to say, okay, so we're done with that, with routines. So how about if a way to evaluate yourself is tomorrow, when you start repeating all of the things that you do every day or as you're doing them, right? Maybe you don't focus on the progressive, just focus on the way you're presenting the language for that point. And if you can list 5, then you're really good. So you set a bar for them because they won't know how far to go or won't know how good is enough. So you have to set, as a teacher, you have to set, and as a language expert, you have to set a bar for them. So try and do, next time you're talking with your friends, try and see if from what they tell you in Spanish, see if you can repeat back to them in English 10 activities they do on a daily basis. If you can do 8 of them, super good. If you can do 10, so sometimes we use the number 10 because we're so familiar with the 10 from all of the academic background, elementary, high school, secondary, university. So sometimes using a 10 reference is good because we know the 10, we understand the 10, and we know what the 10 means. But yeah, if you want to break that, if you want your students to go outside of that, maybe a 5, maybe an 8, So it actually depends on you as a teacher, where you want to set the bar, and then how you can say what's good, what's insufficient. You never want to say something like, you're doing a bad job. That is something you never want to do. You never want to say to your students. You might say something like, you need to work at it. Okay, so it could be like when you're saying a qualitative reference, you might say something like excellent, really good, good, needs work, right? Check with the teacher. Maybe instead of saying, not, you don't want to say like, you don't know, you're terrible. You might, your bottom level might be something like, be sure to check with your teacher about this. So there you go. Notice how you're keeping it on the positive side and you're getting all of that negative word outside. You don't want, because if you put negative words in there, um, you're not promoting self-learning in that sense. So these are some of the things that you could do in a general scope as a teacher to promote learner autonomy. Now we have one more slide after this, and in that one we will focus on just some ideas of what you can do in a practical sense. We kind of already got to it here with the learning journal, but in the next slide we'll see at some practical things that you could do to promote learner autonomy. Okay, so let's see. So we have all of these concepts. We have distance learning, we have autonomy, we have learner autonomy, we have teacher promoting learner autonomy. Oh my God, there's so much information. So it's great. It kind of intertwines, it's connected, teacher, student, learner, teaching, so on and so forth. But we always have to come back to that question. Okay, so what does this look like in the real world? And that's what this slide is for. Now, here are just some general things, some general practical things that you could do as a teacher to promote learner autonomy. And perhaps your task for this, as I go through these, there's like 5 pictures, is how does this relate to what autonomy is? And see if you can find that motivation and metacognitive thing and intrinsic and extrinsic and all of those conceptual factors. How are they represented into this practical solution, if you will? Right. So let's go on here to the first one. And in the previous slide, I already mentioned it. It's the journal. So again, there's you will want to tell the student how to do the journal. it is most likely that they are not accustomed to doing learning journals. So that means that you need to provide a framework or a structure to that, and how they're going to divide content, if they're going to divide it. So you're going to have to tell them. And I was mentioning before, be sure to include a diary section, maybe with guide questions on a weekly basis, and um, and just keep checking that over maybe once a semester, or maybe 2 or 3 times, and then have them deliver that at the end. But be sure to return it with feedback. That's so important. Also, the feedback that you give them. Uh, and I mentioned also I would include the link to another video which I recorded a couple of years ago, where I talk more in depth about journals and how they work and how you can structure them. So be sure to look for that in the attached note. Moving on to the next one here is discussion, collaboration, socialization, or as I like to call it in my classes, in my English classes, mingle. If you go to any of my students from English from years ago and recently, more or less, everybody knows what mingle is. This is something I teach even from level 1, is I tell them as we're looking at the expectations of the course. In this course, you're going to do something. And I write on the board. I try to do this with intrinsic. I'll try and do it one more time here. I don't know if I'm going to do a good job, but I think that regardless, you will be able to read the word. Almost done here. So any of my students will understand what this word means, mingle, which is basically, like I tell them, it's another word for socialization. To learn a language, you need to socialize. It's inevitable. That's why we talk. That's why we use languages, to socialize, to mingle. So at different points, I would work mingle scenarios into the lesson plans. So in that same sense, obviously in a distance course, it's a little trickier because we don't have that face-to-face. However, if it is possible for you to set up a schedule where you have like video chat, a video chat would be perfect in a distance environment. Or if it is not so convenient, maybe just a text chat, also really good, where everybody's online at the same time. You have some synchronous communication going on. And as a teacher, you're just monitoring and pushing and shoving and nudging in the right direction as they're communicating with the text, or through the text more so. So that would be another great practical way of promoting that learner autonomy. You get all the activities and then you give a date. So this is when we're going to have our live chat. So you get them for a specific goal, right? Okay, using the multimedia of the learning environment, which is the internet. So it's so important that you use all of the resources you have. In a classroom, we might kind of fall back on the print, the copies, and in the copies you have the pictures. But because they're copied, they're black and white or they're grayed, and that's kind of okay. But in the learning environment, you don't need to stick to that. You could have video, audio, pictures in full color, high definition pictures, low definition pictures. You can, depending on the conditions, you can work with that content. So it's engaging, it's colorful, it's attractive to students, and it gets them motivated to learn even more and more. So be sure to use all of that, and just having that understanding that for students that this course has so much richness in it, not just for the text and the exercise, but the way they're presented in color and engaging and interactive, that I want to learn. So just creating that, you're indirectly promoting autonomy in that sense. Right, study guides. Now, study guides is something that I've picked up as I've been doing my master's studies, and I found them to be an incredible autonomy resource that the teacher can provide. And a study guide is basically, or I guess it reflects back to elementary school, I think. At least I remember when I was in elementary, we would have these, well, I kind of remember them as bibliography cards, but in my elementary school, what the teacher did is would have an index box with all of these cards, and they would all have like topics from our unit. So there, I clearly remember some about the solar system, and there you had some references to the book where you could get content from, and it also included like a little picture of to kind of help you contextualize in a visual way, and it has a little explanation. So it kind of what I'm getting at is that little bibliography card gave you sufficient content for you to, when you went to the book, it helped direct your attention to the key points of the text. So as you were reading it, you were not just reading it to get the entire text, but you were reading it because you're looking for specific information. That activity of looking for specific information in the text focuses the attention, and then that helps the student to discern what's not important and what is truly important. And then once you have the essence of that, then the autonomous learner says, is this everything that I want? Or maybe from this that the teacher is telling me to focus on, this is really what's important to me. So notice how we're taking all of that garbage and just by doing a little study guide. So I highly recommend these. I found them to be incredibly powerful in helping to promote learner autonomy. Yes, helping to conceptualize everything. How to use stuff. Here, well, we have mental maps. You're probably familiar with mental mapping, which is you're taking broad strokes of information and you're presenting them in a visual way of some kind, where they have connections between them. So you want to develop these ideas of strategies and methods of how can you learn. So this is maybe something not that's tangible, but you might say like, okay, we're going to do the passive, right? You're talking about, I don't know, reporting the news. Maybe that's your topic. Let's report the news. And so how are you going to report the news? So you need to set up a strategy there. And maybe embedded to that is the passive and the indirect questions, so to speak. So the student might not have an idea of how to do that. We'll be able to follow the instructions you give, but at the same time, you want to give him or her some strategies that he or she can adapt or use at a personal level. And a strategy would be like, for example, the mental map. But if we're talking about news, it could be a question star. It could be a conceptual table. It could be a web diagram, which is a sort of a simplified version of a mental map. We can have so many other structures for strategies that the student can use to use whatever content we're working with. And there you go. So these are some of the practical sense. Let me just go through them super quick. So we have the learning manual, which is the tangible. They could either, well, because it's online, they will probably do it in a word processor. But if you want to take it a step further, you could ask them on a distance course to do it in a physical notebook and then take pictures of that and then upload those and you check the pictures. By telling them to do a manual, you're making that distance experience, you're making it real. Because now they're taking something real out of it. To socialize, so you want to set up forum discussions, real live chat discussions, and if possible, video chat discussions, where you practice what you're working with. You want to use the full scope of online resources. You want to use study guides to help focus attention of the learner. And you want to do like mental mapping strategies for any sort of activity that you're doing with specific content. And that, in essence, is a practical sense of, or some ideas that you can practically do to promote learner autonomy. Now, if you go back to the other points of how to monitor, how to evaluate, how to take responsibility, and all of those little points, I'm sure that you can find some other practical solutions to promote learner autonomy based on those ideas. So you might take something like, well, I want to promote in the autonomy department, I want to promote responsibility. So what can I practically do to promote responsibility? Well, maybe you can set, I don't know, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, you could set up a collaborative calendar where you tell your students, okay, and you set a date. So this is when we're going to finish Unit 1. What activities are you going to do in these 3 days to help you practice and learn what we're going to do on this other day? So boom, right there, you're promoting learner responsibility. And it's so easy nowadays. I mean, we have Google Calendar to do that. So everybody has to need to have a Gmail account. Or if you want to take advantage of Facebook, for example, you could set up an event and have everybody work in that event and set up their calendar in that way. So, I mean, you take one of those concepts of autonomy and then you question yourself, well, how can I promote this concept? And you try and come up with a practical solution for that. And there you go. Pretty cool, eh? And so we've come to the end of this video lesson. I hope that you have found it most useful in the concepts that we've been talking about, and also the practical solutions that I've recommended, and also the strategy that I told you. Notice how, in a way, I'm also promoting your autonomy by giving you a hint of how you could possibly come up with some practical solutions based on these theoretical points that I've mentioned throughout this video lesson. There, again, I am promoting learner autonomy. So I hope that this video lesson has been useful for you in understanding how autonomy works in the distance learning environment, and how you as a teacher, what you need to look for and how you can promote it if in case you don't see it in your students. As a final note here, I just would like to point out that learner autonomy, you might think that learner autonomy is something that everybody has. All of your students have it. They are probably just not aware of it. It's not something that you eat and then you suddenly have. It's not something that you teach. It's not something that comes from the outside and you put it in. It's something everybody already has. So as a teacher, you're not teaching them anything. You're just showing them and helping them become aware of their autonomy for whatever purpose they might consider important in their lives. And that is really it. You will not get the complete aspect, but for your course in their stage of life, it will have the relevant impact it should. And that's it. So I hope once again that this video lesson has been useful for you in your practices. Feel free to go back and check different parts of it. You'll note at the bottom you have the navigation control, so you can go back and forth. You can click on the track bar to go at different stages. And well, so thank you so much for watching and holding on all the way to the end now. I am Teacher Eduardo, and I will see you next time.